This is episode 16 of Cold War, Detente 1969-1975. By the end of the 1960s, the United States and Soviet Union faced a choice: slow down their Cold War competition, a process that would be called Detente, or continue an arms race that could end in an all-out war. In 1969, a new U.S. President, Richard Nixon, came to power. Nixon had new ideas about how to make the Cold War less dangerous. He was ready to accept the Soviet Union as America's nuclear equal. Although Nixon wanted to revise Washington's Cold War strategy, his first priority was to get American troops out of the war in Vietnam. By 1969, the war had cost the lives of 30,000 U.S. troops, with no end in sight. Nixon told his South Vietnamese allies he planned to withdraw U.S. troops and hand over the ground war to the Vietnamese, in a process the Nixon administration called Vietnamization. In 1969, the first U.S. troops were pulled out of Vietnam. In Vietnam, the northern government in Hanoi launched a new offensive against the U.S.-supported South. Nixon agreed to his general's suggestion that U.S. warplanes bomb the North Vietnam's bases in neutral Cambodia, but he insisted the raids be kept secret. Despite Nixon's wishes, the American public found out about the bombing campaign in Cambodia, and anti-war demonstrations took place across the country. Nixon countered with what became known as his silent majority speech, asking the American people for his support. After it became clear the Cambodian raids were not helping U.S. efforts in South Vietnam, Nixon ordered a ground assault in Cambodia. More violent protests followed on American campuses. At Kent State University, U.S. National Guardsmen shot and killed 4 students. In Moscow, Communist Party chief Leonid Brezhnev wanted to relax Cold War tensions with America in a policy that would be called Detente. His thoughts coincided with ideas presented by Willy Brandt, the former mayor of Berlin and the new West German chancellor. Brandt wanted to improve relations with the Soviet bloc. His plans, called Ostpolitik, included the recognition of rival East Germany as a state. Brandt became the first West German chancellor to visit East Germany. He also visited Moscow and Poland, and agreed to recognize Poland's western border, which had been carved out of territory seized from Germany in 1945. Brandt's action eased tensions between the two Germanys, but they also worried the United States, which feared it could lead to German nationalism. Richard Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger were the architects of the new approach to the Cold War. The two men preferred to work in secret. Through back channels, they set up summit meetings in Beijing and Moscow. They wanted the summits in China and the USSR to help the United States get out of Vietnam. They also hoped to bring China into their diplomatic game. The pair alarmed the Soviets by traveling to Beijing for a historic summit with the Chinese leadership. Soon after, in March 1972, North Vietnam launched a new offensive on the south. Nixon responded with more air attacks in the north. The U.S. retaliation appeared to put a proposed U.S.-Soviet summit in jeopardy. Would the Soviets receive Nixon in Moscow while his planes were bombing their North Vietnamese ally? But the summit went ahead in May. Despite harsh Soviet rhetoric, both sides agreed to limit nuclear weapons, laying the foundations for Detente. 2 weeks after Nixon's return from Moscow, men working for his re-election campaign were arrested for breaking into the Washington headquarters of the Democratic Party. It was the start of a major scandal, Watergate. At the same time, Kissinger was negotiating with the North Vietnamese on ending the war in Vietnam. Hanoi presented to Kissinger with a draft agreement, but the South Vietnamese government refused to sign it. The peace talks broke down. Nixon ordered air raids on North Vietnam, hoping to pressure Hanoi into an agreement while bolstering the South. The bombing served its purpose. North and South Vietnam agreed to the deal Kissinger had put together. Under the peace accords, U.S. troops would leave Vietnam, the Saigon government would stay in power, but North Vietnam's troops would stay in the South. In August 1974, facing impeachment over the Watergate scandal, Nixon resigned as U.S. president and was replaced by Gerald Ford. The Soviet leadership was astounded by Nixon's downfall. Meanwhile, the Vietnam peace accords had not stopped the fighting there. The South struggled unsuccessfully to defend itself against Hanoi's final offensive. By April 1975, the remaining Americans in Saigon fled. As Vietnam came under communist control, South Soviet leaders hoped to guarantee the USSR's security and world power status with a treaty that would recognize the post-war division of Europe. But the treaty, to be signed in Helsinki, ran into a stumbling block: human rights. Members of the U.S. Congress were taking the Soviet Union to task over its treatment of dissidents. Despite differences over human rights, an agreement was signed, and U.S.-Soviet détente was underway. The most public symbol of the new relationship between the rival superpowers was the Apollo-Soyuz project. In space, cooperation was replacing years of Cold War confrontation. So whenever you're ready, please go ahead and watch the episode.